Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most terrifying and fascinating secrets. Imagine sitting down to what could be your final meal, not because you're facing execution, but because it's literally your job to die for someone else's dinner. Picture yourself in a world where a single bite of bread could end your life in minutes, where a sip of wine might be your last, and where your only purpose is to discover poison by becoming its victim. This isn't some medieval fantasy or Hollywood drama. This was the daily reality for thousands of men and women throughout history who held what was arguably the most dangerous job ever created, the royal food taster. And what I'm about to reveal will shock you about just how far the powerful would go to protect themselves, and how the powerless were sacrificed in the most casual, horrifying ways imaginable. Before we begin this incredible journey together, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you curled up somewhere cozy, or maybe taking a late-night walk? Your stories and comments always inspire the tales I choose to explore, so please share where this story finds you. Now, let's step back to a world where dinner was a battlefield, and every meal was a potential murder scene. Florence, Italy, 1478. The Medici Palace glows with candlelight as the most powerful family in Renaissance Europe prepares for their evening feast. But before Lorenzo de' Medici, the unofficial ruler of Florence, takes a single bite of his roasted quail, a young man named Giuseppe steps forward. He's 22 years old, recently married, and his wife is expecting their first child. Giuseppe has been chosen for an honor that he knows might kill him. With hands that tremble slightly, Giuseppe cuts a small piece from Lorenzo's meat. The room falls silent as he chews slowly, methodically. Everyone watches his face for any sign of distress, any indication that death has been served alongside dinner. Giuseppe swallows, waits 30 seconds, then nods to his master. Only then does Lorenzo begin to eat. Giuseppe survives this meal, but he knows that tomorrow night, he'll perform this same ritual again. And the night after that. And every night until either his luck runs out, or he's too old to serve his deadly purpose. This is the world of the pregustator, the professional food taster, and Giuseppe is just one of thousands who lived and died in service to the paranoid appetites of the powerful. You might wonder why anyone would willingly take such a job. The answer reveals something deeply disturbing about medieval and Renaissance society. For most food tasters, it wasn't a choice at all. They were slaves, prisoners, debtors, or desperate peasants who had no other options. Some were children, selected because their smaller bodies would react more quickly to poison, making them more effective early warning systems. The economics of food tasting created an entire underground industry that most people never knew existed. Wealthy families didn't just employ one taster, they employed teams. A typical royal household might have 12 to 15 food tasters working in shifts, each specializing in different types of detection. There were wine tasters, bread tasters, meat tasters, and even water tasters. Each meal became an elaborate choreography of potential death. But here's where the story becomes truly horrifying. Medieval food tasters weren't just testing for deadly poisons. They were testing for dozens of different substances that could cause anything from mild illness to slow, agonizing death. The poisoner's art had become so sophisticated by the 1400s that there were toxins designed to kill immediately, others that would cause death weeks later, and some that would slowly drive victims insane over months or years. Master Giovanni Torriani, court physician to the Duke of Milan, kept detailed records of the substances his food tasters detected between 1456 and 1461. His journals, discovered in a monastery library in 1982, reveal the staggering variety of deadly compounds that regularly appeared in noble dining rooms. Arsenic mixed with sugar to mask the metallic taste. Mercury compounds dissolved in wine. Crushed glass hidden in bread. Extracts from deadly nightshade berries mixed into fruit preserves. Perhaps most chilling were the slow-acting poisons. Torriani documented cases where food tasters would consume contaminated food, show no immediate symptoms, and then die mysterious deaths weeks later. By then, the connection to their work was often forgotten, and their deaths were attributed to natural causes. These tasters were literally dying slow deaths for meals they had consumed and forgotten. The psychological toll on these men and women was devastating. Many food tasters developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress. They would refuse to eat anything outside of their official duties, surviving on the bare minimum of tested food. Some became unable to swallow without violent panic attacks. Others developed obsessive rituals around eating that consumed their entire lives. Lady Catherine Sforza, the ruthless ruler of Forli, kept a diary between 1488 and 1492 that included detailed observations of her food tasters' mental deterioration. She wrote with clinical detachment about how her tasters would often weep while performing their duties, knowing that each meal might be their last. She noted that the average food taster in her service lasted only 18 months before either dying or becoming too psychologically damaged to continue. But Catherine's diary also reveals something that makes this story even more disturbing. She wasn't just observing her tasters' suffering, she was deliberately causing it. Catherine would sometimes have harmless but bitter or nauseating substances added to food specifically to test her tasters' loyalty and reactions. She wanted to ensure they weren't building up immunity to certain poisons or becoming too comfortable with their role. The training process for food tasters was both extensive and terrifying. New recruits would spend weeks learning to identify different types of poisons by taste, smell, and immediate physical reaction. They were taught to recognize the slightly sweet taste of antifreeze compounds, the bitter almond scent of cyanide-based toxins, and the metallic aftertaste of heavy metal poisoning. More experienced tasters developed an almost supernatural ability to detect poison. They could identify contaminated food by subtle changes in color, texture, or aroma that would be invisible to ordinary people. Some claimed they could sense poison by holding food near their face without even tasting it. Whether this was real sensitivity or psychological conditioning, these skills often meant the difference between life and death. The most skilled food tasters became valuable commodities who could command high wages and better working conditions. Master taster Alessandro Benedetti worked for 5 different Italian noble families between 1475 and 1501, and his personal contracts, preserved in the Vatican archives, reveal the extraordinary measures taken to keep expert tasters alive and healthy. Benedetti's contract with the Borgias included provisions for a personal physician, a dedicated food preparation area where his own meals would be prepared by trusted cooks, and even a clause requiring that he be given advance notice of any particularly dangerous political situations that might increase the likelihood of assassination attempts. The Borgias were essentially treating their food taster like a precious piece of equipment that needed careful maintenance. But for every Alessandro Benedetti who achieved something resembling professional status, there were hundreds of anonymous tasters who died horrible deaths in service to their master's paranoia. The records from the Papal States between 1450 and 1500 show that the average life expectancy of a food taster was just 28 years. Most died not from sudden poisoning, but from the cumulative effects of consuming small amounts of various toxins over months or years. Dr. Maria Lucia Bertolotti, a modern toxicologist who studied historical poisoning records, made a shocking discovery in her research. She found that many food tasters were probably suffering from chronic heavy metal poisoning, mercury toxicity, and other forms of slow poisoning that would have caused progressive brain damage, organ failure, and eventual death. They were being slowly murdered by the very job that was supposed to protect their masters. The social status of food tasters was deliberately kept ambiguous. They were too valuable to treat as ordinary servants, but too expendable to treat as true professionals. They lived in a strange liminal space between life and death, safety and danger, importance and disposability. Many tasters developed intense loyalty to their masters, not out of affection, but because their survival depended entirely on their masters' continued protection and favor. Some food tasters tried to gain additional security by learning to prepare antidotes and developing immunity to certain poisons. They would gradually expose themselves to small amounts of various toxins, hoping to build up resistance. This practice, known as Mithridatism after the ancient king Mithridates VI, was incredibly dangerous and often backfired spectacularly. The case of Roberto Malatesta, a food taster in the service of Pope Sixtus IV, illustrates both the promise and peril of this approach. Roberto successfully built up immunity to several arsenic-based compounds and even survived 2 deliberate poisoning attempts that would have killed ordinary people. But his immune system became so compromised by constant exposure to toxins that he died from a simple respiratory infection that his body could no longer fight off. The geographic spread of professional food tasting reveals just how universal the fear of poisoning had become among the powerful classes. Chinese emperors employed food tasters as early as 300 BCE. Byzantine emperors had elaborate tasting protocols that required multiple tasters for each course. Islamic rulers in medieval Spain maintained networks of tasters that included specialists in detecting different regional poisoning traditions. But it was in Renaissance Italy that food tasting reached its most sophisticated and deadly form. The Italian city-states were locked in constant political warfare, and poisoning had become so common that noble families spent fortunes on protection systems that were essentially early warning networks of human sacrifice. The Venetian Council of Ten, the secretive governing body of the Venetian Republic, maintained detailed records of poisoning attempts and food taster casualties between 1400 and 1550. These records, sealed for centuries and only recently made available to historians, reveal that Venice alone employed over 200 professional food tasters during this period. Of these, 147 died in service, and most of the survivors were retired due to health problems related to poison exposure. What makes these statistics even more horrifying is that Venice was considered one of the safer Italian states during this period. Cities like Milan, Florence, and Rome had much higher casualty rates among their food tasters, suggesting that the practice of political poisoning was far more widespread and deadly than most historical accounts acknowledge. The technology of poison detection was primitive by modern standards, but food tasters developed ingenious methods for identifying contaminated food. Some used special silver utensils that would tarnish in the presence of certain sulfur-based compounds. Others employed trained animals, particularly dogs and birds, as secondary detection systems. The most skilled tasters learned to read the subtle behavioral cues of these animals to gain additional warning of dangerous substances. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the food taster system was how it normalized the idea that some human lives were essentially expendable for the convenience and security of others. Noble families would discuss their tasters' deaths with the same casual concern they might show for a broken piece of furniture or a lame horse. The dehumanization was so complete that many tasters' names were never even recorded in household accounts. As we prepare to explore deeper into this dark world, consider the daily reality of someone like Giuseppe, the young man we met at the beginning of our story. Every morning, he woke up knowing that his breakfast might be his last meal. Every evening, he said goodbye to his pregnant wife knowing he might not return home. Every bite he took was a roll of the dice with death itself. And yet, Giuseppe and thousands like him continued to serve, continued to risk their lives, continued to die in service to a system that valued their master's peace of mind more than their very existence. Their stories have been largely forgotten by history, but their sacrifice reveals something profound about the lengths to which power will go to protect itself, and the depths to which powerlessness can be exploited. But Giuseppe's story, and the stories of countless other food tasters, also reveal something else: the incredible resilience of human beings faced with impossible circumstances. These men and women developed strategies for survival, forms of resistance, and ways of finding meaning and dignity even in the face of constant mortal danger. They created their own communities, their own codes of honor, and their own methods of protecting each other in a world that saw them as nothing more than expendable instruments of detection. In our next exploration, we'll meet the food tasters who fought back against the system that enslaved them, the poisoners who turned the dinner table into a battlefield, and the incredible true stories of survival and rebellion that emerged from history's most dangerous dining rooms. We'll discover how some tasters became master poisoners themselves, using their intimate knowledge of toxins to gain power over their former masters. We'll explore the secret networks of information that connected food tasters across different courts, and we'll uncover the shocking truth about how some of history's most famous political assassinations were actually inside jobs, carried out by the very people who were supposed to prevent them. The world of the food taster was far more complex, dangerous, and fascinating than most people realize. It was a world where loyalty and betrayal danced together at every meal, where survival required not just courage but incredible intelligence and cunning, and where the line between protector and assassin was often thinner than the edge of a knife blade. The candles flickered in the underground chamber beneath the Palazzo Medici as Master Bernardo Cellini carefully measured crystalline powder onto a brass scale. But Bernardo wasn't preparing medicine or mixing pigments for art. He was creating death itself, and his workshop represented the dark mirror of the food taster's world. For every Giuseppe risking his life to detect poison, there was a Bernardo perfecting the art of making it undetectable. Welcome to the shadowy realm of the Renaissance poison masters, where chemistry became murder and dinner invitations were potential death sentences. What I'm about to reveal will show you that the world of medieval poisoning was far more sophisticated, widespread, and terrifying than any modern thriller could imagine. Bernardo's workshop, discovered during renovations in 1847 but kept secret by the Medici family for decades, contained over 300 different toxic substances, each carefully labeled with cryptic symbols that only he could read. There were extracts from plants that didn't officially exist, mineral compounds that wouldn't be identified by science for another 200 years, and animal venoms collected from creatures found on 3 different continents. But Bernardo wasn't just mixing poisons randomly. He was part of an underground network of poison masters who had turned assassination into a precise science. These weren't crude murderers throwing arsenic into wine glasses. They were master craftsmen who could design a death to occur at a specific time, mimic any natural illness, or even drive victims slowly insane over months while leaving no trace of foul play. The profession of poison making attracted some of the most brilliant minds of the Renaissance. Many were trained physicians who had become fascinated by the thin line between medicine and murder. Others were alchemists whose experiments with transforming base metals into gold had taught them the deadly properties of various chemical compounds. Some were simply entrepreneurs who recognized that in a world where political murder was commonplace, there would always be a market for reliable, undetectable death. Dr. Elena Mocchetti's recent analysis of poison master workshops discovered throughout Italy has revealed the staggering sophistication of Renaissance toxicology. These workshops contained equipment that wouldn't look out of place in a modern chemistry laboratory. Distillation apparatus for concentrating plant extracts. Precision scales for measuring doses down to individual grains. Temperature-controlled environments for cultivating toxic molds and bacteria. But perhaps most shocking was the level of human experimentation these poison masters conducted. Bernardo's journals, written in a code that took cryptographers 150 years to decipher, describe systematic testing of different compounds on prisoners, slaves, and volunteers. He would carefully document the onset time, duration, and specific symptoms of various poisons, building a comprehensive database of toxic effects that allowed him to customize deaths for specific political purposes. The economics of the poison trade were staggering. A single dose of Bernardo's most sophisticated compounds could cost the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money. But for wealthy families locked in political warfare, this was considered a bargain compared to the cost of raising armies or conducting open warfare. Poison offered a way to eliminate enemies quietly, efficiently, and with plausible deniability. The most expensive poisons weren't necessarily the most deadly. The real value was in subtlety and undetectability. Bernardo's masterpiece was a compound he called the gentle sleep, which would cause victims to gradually lose mental capacity over 6 months, eventually dying of what appeared to be natural senility. The poison was virtually undetectable and gave clients the perfect alibi since the death occurred so long after administration. But the poison masters faced constant danger from their own products and from the violent world they served. Many died from accidental exposure to their own creations. Others were murdered by clients who wanted to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. Some were tortured to death by rivals who wanted to steal their formulas. The life expectancy of a poison master was even shorter than that of a food taster. Caterina Sforza, whom we met in our previous exploration, wasn't just employing food tasters. She was also patronizing poison masters, and her court became one of the most advanced centers of toxicological research in Renaissance Europe. Caterina's personal poison master, a mysterious figure known only as Illinois Silenzioso, the Silent One, created compounds so sophisticated that modern forensic scientists still struggle to understand how they worked. Illinois Silenzioso's greatest innovation was the development of delayed action poisons that could be programmed to activate weeks or even months after administration. He achieved this by encasing toxic compounds in materials that would dissolve slowly in the human digestive system, essentially creating time-release death capsules centuries before modern pharmaceutical technology. The case of Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere illustrates the terrifying precision of Renaissance poisoning. In 1484, the cardinal began experiencing mysterious symptoms that his physicians couldn't diagnose. Progressive weakness, intermittent fever, and episodes of confusion that came and went unpredictably. The symptoms persisted for 7 months before the cardinal finally died of what appeared to be a wasting disease. Modern analysis of preserved tissue samples from the cardinal's body, conducted in 1992, revealed traces of mercury compounds that had been chemically modified to release slowly over time. Someone had essentially turned the cardinal's own body into a poison delivery system, ensuring his death while making it appear completely natural. The sophistication required for such a murder suggests it was the work of a master poisoner like Illinois Silenzioso. The training process for poison masters was incredibly secretive and dangerous. Most learned their craft through apprenticeships that could last decades. Apprentices would begin by learning to identify and cultivate poisonous plants, then progress to basic chemical extraction techniques, and finally to the advanced art of combining different toxins to create new compounds with specific effects. The most advanced poison masters could create what they called signature poisons, compounds designed to produce specific symptoms that would implicate particular enemies or create specific political narratives around the victim's death. A poison that caused symptoms resembling plague might be used to create panic and social disruption. A compound that produced symptoms similar to those caused by French mercury treatments might be used to suggest the victim had contracted syphilis, destroying their reputation even in death. But the poison masters also faced constant pressure from the food tasters who were becoming increasingly skilled at detection. This led to an escalating arms race between poisoners and tasters that drove innovation on both sides. Poison masters developed new compounds specifically designed to fool experienced tasters, while tasters developed new detection methods to identify these advanced poisons. Some poison masters specialized in creating compounds that would actually improve the taste of food while killing the consumer. These enhancement poisons were particularly insidious because they made contaminated food more appealing rather than less, increasing the likelihood that victims would consume fatal doses. Master Giuseppe Torriani, not to be confused with the physician we mentioned earlier, became famous for his honey-based compounds that made any food irresistibly delicious while delivering precise doses of fatal toxins. The geographic reach of the Poison Master network was truly international. Venetian merchants carried toxic compounds to Constantinople and brought back exotic poisons from the Byzantine Empire. Spanish conquistadors brought New World plant toxins back to European workshops. Arab traders provided access to African plant and animal venoms that were unknown in Europe. This international trade in death created a global economy of assassination that operated parallel to legitimate commerce. Ships that carried spices and silk also carried carefully concealed samples of rare poisons. Diplomatic pouches contained not just treaties and letters, but vials of death intended for enemies in foreign courts. The same trade routes that connected civilizations also connected their killers. The most successful poison masters maintained networks of agents throughout Europe who would gather intelligence about potential targets, deliver products to clients, and eliminate witnesses when necessary. These networks operated like early multinational corporations, with sophisticated communication systems, quality control procedures, and customer service protocols. Master Antonio Belli maintained detailed customer records that have survived in the Florentine State Archives. His client list reads like a who's who of Renaissance politics and included popes, cardinals, merchant princes, condottieri, and even foreign royalty. Belli offered different service packages ranging from simple single-dose assassinations to complex multi-target campaigns that could eliminate entire political factions over months or years. But Belli's records also reveal the personal cost of his profession. He writes about the constant nightmares, the inability to eat food prepared by others, and the crushing isolation of living in a world where everyone was either a potential client or a potential victim. Many poison masters developed severe paranoia and would only trust food prepared by their own hands using ingredients they had personally gathered and tested. The relationship between poison masters and food tasters was more complex than simple opposition. Some poison masters were former food tasters who had survived long enough to learn about toxins from direct experience. Others employed food tasters to test their own food, creating a bizarre situation where people whose job was preventing poisoning were working for people whose job was perfecting it. There are documented cases of poison masters and food tasters who developed working relationships based on mutual professional respect. Master Lorenzo Calli regularly employed a former food taster named Pietro to test his compounds and provide feedback on detectability. Pietro would consume small amounts of Calli's experimental poisons and describe the onset of symptoms, the intensity of effects, and the likelihood that other tasters would identify the substances. This collaboration between poisoner and taster led to some of the most sophisticated toxic compounds ever created. Calli's partnership with Pietro produced a series of poisons that were specifically designed to fool the most experienced food tasters. These compounds would produce no immediate symptoms but would cause the taster to develop a false sense of security, leading them to approve contaminated food that would kill the intended victim hours later. The documentation of poison effects became increasingly scientific during the Renaissance. Master poisoners kept detailed records not just of their formulas, but of the specific physiological effects of their compounds. They noted onset times, symptom progression, duration of suffering, and methods of death with the same clinical precision that modern medical researchers use to document drug trials. These records reveal that poison masters were essentially conducting systematic human experimentation on a massive scale. They were learning about human physiology, biochemistry, and toxicology through deliberate murder, building a body of knowledge that was simultaneously scientifically valuable and morally horrifying. The psychological profiles of successful poison masters show common traits that are both fascinating and disturbing. Most displayed extraordinary patience, as the best poisons often took months to perfect and sometimes years to deploy effectively. They showed remarkable attention to detail, since a single mistake in measurement or timing could mean the difference between success and discovery. And they demonstrated an ability to compartmentalize moral considerations that allowed them to view human death as simply another technical problem to be solved. But perhaps most unsettling was their capacity for long-term strategic thinking. The best poison masters didn't just kill individual targets. They orchestrated complex political changes through carefully planned series of deaths. They could engineer succession crises, eliminate entire bloodlines, and reshape the balance of power between city-states through patient, methodical assassination campaigns that unfolded over decades. Master Rodrigo Borgia, who later became Pope Alexander VI, employed a poison master known as Illinois Architetta, the architect, specifically for such strategic campaigns. Illinois Architetta's surviving plans, discovered in the Vatican's secret archives in 1981, reveal assassination schemes of breathtaking complexity and ambition. He proposed eliminating specific combinations of cardinals, nobles, and foreign dignitaries in precise sequences that would create power vacuums, allowing Borgia's allies to rise to prominence. The tools and techniques used by poison masters evolved rapidly during the Renaissance as they competed with each other for clients and struggled to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated detection methods. Simple plant extracts gave way to complex chemical compounds. Crude mixing procedures were replaced by precise pharmaceutical techniques. Obvious delivery methods like contaminated wine were abandoned in favor of subtle approaches that left victims with no idea they had been poisoned. But the poison master's greatest enemy wasn't the food tasters or the authorities. It was their own success. As poisoning became more common and more sophisticated, potential victims became increasingly paranoid and security-conscious. The very effectiveness of the poison master's work created a market demand for better protection, leading to the development of new detection methods, more extensive food tasting protocols, and ultimately the creation of early toxicology laboratories dedicated to identifying poisons. The end of the golden age of poison masters came not through law enforcement or moral outrage, but through technological advancement and changing political structures. As centralized governments became stronger and more stable, the chaotic world of city-state politics that had created such demand for assassination services began to disappear. Professional armies replaced personal vendettas as the primary method of political change. But the knowledge and techniques developed by Renaissance poison masters didn't disappear. Their formulas were preserved in coded manuscripts that passed through generations of practitioners. Their methods influenced the development of legitimate chemistry and pharmacology, and their approach to systematic human experimentation provided a dark template that would be followed by researchers and governments for centuries to come. As we prepare to explore the next chapter in our story, consider the world that Giuseppe and his fellow food tasters were really facing. They weren't just protecting their masters from crude assassins throwing obvious poisons into wine glasses. They were standing between their employers and some of the most sophisticated killing machines in human history, master craftsmen who had turned murder into a precise science and human death into a carefully engineered work of art. The food tasters knew they were outmatched, outgunned, and ultimately expendable. But they also knew something that the poison masters didn't fully understand, that the relationship between hunter and hunted, between poisoner and protector, was about to shift in ways that would transform the deadly game of Renaissance politics forever. In our next exploration, we'll discover how some food tasters turned the tables on their would-be killers, how they developed their own networks of intelligence and protection, and how they ultimately helped bring down the very system that had enslaved them. The moonlight barely penetrated the narrow alleyways of Rome as Marco Santelli made his way through the shadows toward a clandestine meeting that could cost him his life. But Marco wasn't afraid of poison tonight. He was afraid of discovery. Because Marco, a food taster in the service of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, was about to commit the ultimate betrayal of his position. He was going to share information that could save lives instead of simply sacrificing his own. Welcome to the hidden world of food taster resistance, where the victims of history's most dangerous profession fought back against a system designed to consume them. What you're about to discover will reveal that even in the darkest corners of Renaissance politics, ordinary people found extraordinary ways to resist, survive, and ultimately triumph over those who saw them as nothing more than expendable tools. Marco's destination was a small tavern called Illinois Gallo Nero, unremarkable except for the fact that it served as the secret headquarters of something unprecedented in Renaissance Europe. An underground network of food tasters who shared information, provided mutual protection, and worked together to survive in a world that wanted them dead. The network had begun almost by accident 5 years earlier when a dying food taster named Luca Moetti had passed along a list of poison symptoms to another taster, hoping to help him survive longer than Luca had. That simple act of human kindness had grown into a sophisticated intelligence operation that spanned multiple Italian city-states and included hundreds of food tasters, former tasters, and their allies. Dr. Francesco Albertini's research into Vatican personnel records uncovered evidence of this network in 2003, though the Catholic Church had tried to suppress the documents for centuries. What Albertini found was evidence of a systematic rebellion that challenged everything historians thought they knew about power and resistance in Renaissance Europe. The food tasters' network operated under principles that were revolutionary for their time. Information was shared freely among all members regardless of which noble family they served. Tasters would warn each other about specific poisoners, dangerous political situations, and new toxic compounds that had appeared in their master's food. They created an early warning system that helped many tasters survive assassination attempts that would otherwise have been fatal. But the network went far beyond simple information sharing. The tasters had developed their own counterintelligence operations, infiltrating the workshops of poison masters and gathering intelligence about upcoming assassination plots. They maintained safe houses where tasters could hide if they needed to escape dangerous situations. They even operated their own primitive medical facilities where tasters suffering from poison exposure could receive treatment without their masters knowing about it. The leadership of this network was provided by a remarkable woman known only as La Vedova, the widow, whose real identity remains unknown to this day. La Vedova had been a food taster herself before her master was assassinated in a political conspiracy that eliminated his entire household, including most of his food tasters. She had survived only because she happened to be away from the palace when the killers struck. La Vedova's personal letters, discovered in a sealed chamber beneath a Florence church in 1956, reveal a brilliant strategic mind and a deep understanding of both politics and human nature. She recognized that food tasters possessed unique advantages in their struggle for survival. They had access to the most sensitive political information in Europe. They understood the methods and motivations of both their masters and their enemies. And they had nothing left to lose. Under La Vedova's guidance, the taster network began to evolve from a mutual aid society into something much more ambitious, a force capable of influencing the very political conflicts that endangered their lives. If they couldn't escape the deadly game of Renaissance politics, La Vedova reasoned, they could at least change the rules. The network's first major operation involved preventing the assassination of Pope Pius III in 1503. Food tasters in 3 different households had independently discovered evidence of a coordinated poisoning plot that would have eliminated the Pope and several cardinals simultaneously. Instead of simply protecting their own masters, the tasters shared information that allowed the Vatican to identify and arrest most of the conspirators before they could act. This success gave the network credibility and attracted new members, but it also made them dangerous enemies. The poison masters quickly realized that their centuries-old advantage was being eroded by organized resistance from their intended victims. Some poison masters began specifically targeting network members, trying to eliminate the tasters who were most effective at detecting and preventing their work. The conflict between the poison masters and the taster network escalated into what modern intelligence analysts would recognize as a covert war. Both sides developed increasingly sophisticated methods for gathering information about each other. Both sides began using double agents and false information. Both sides started eliminating each other's key personnel through targeted assassinations. But the food tasters had one crucial advantage. They were already assumed to be expendable by the powerful people around them. This meant they could operate with a degree of invisibility that was impossible for poison masters, who needed to maintain relationships with wealthy clients and secure workshops for their activities. The tasters exploited this invisibility brilliantly. They developed communication methods that used their existing duties as cover for intelligence operations. A taster could pass information to colleagues in other households by leaving coded messages in markets where he was sent to inspect food purchases. Tasters could identify poison masters by sharing descriptions of suspicious individuals who had been seen near their masters' kitchens. One of the network's most effective strategies was the systematic documentation of poison masters and their methods. Tasters would carefully record everything they observed about the people, substances, and techniques involved in assassination attempts. This information was collected, analyzed, and distributed through the network, creating the first comprehensive database of Renaissance poisoning methods. The database revealed patterns that individual tasters had never noticed. Certain poison masters had distinctive techniques that could be identified across multiple assassination attempts. Some noble families showed preferences for specific types of poisons that reflected their relationships with particular poison masters. Most importantly, the database allowed tasters to predict when and how assassination attempts were likely to occur. Marco Santelli's mission on this particular night was to deliver intelligence that could prevent a massacre. The network had discovered evidence of a plot to eliminate 12 different cardinals simultaneously during an upcoming papal ceremony. The poison would be delivered through specially prepared communion wine that would be distributed to specific targets during the religious service. But Marco's information was even more specific than that. The network had identified the poison master responsible for the plot, discovered his workshop location, and learned the exact chemical composition of the compound he planned to use. They had even identified the corrupt Vatican official who was helping to coordinate the assassination attempts. The intelligence that Marco carried represented months of work by dozens of network members who had risked their lives to gather information piece by piece. Some had infiltrated poison workshops by posing as apprentices. Others had seduced servants in cardinal households to learn about internal security arrangements. Still others had developed relationships with corrupt officials who were unknowingly providing information about their own assassination plots. The sophistication of these operations rivaled anything conducted by modern intelligence agencies. The food tasters had learned to compartmentalize information so that no single individual could compromise the entire network if captured. They used coded communications that could be hidden in ordinary business transactions. They developed extensive background checks for new members to prevent infiltration by enemy agents. But perhaps most remarkably, the network had developed its own training programs that taught food tasters skills far beyond simple poison detection. They learned basic chemistry so they could better understand how different toxins worked. They studied politics and economics so they could predict when assassination attempts were likely to occur. They even learned rudimentary medical techniques so they could treat poison exposure without relying on physicians who might report their activities to authorities. The case of Giuseppe Torini illustrates how effective this training could be. Giuseppe had been a simple food taster in the service of a Milanese merchant before joining the network. Within 2 years, he had become one of their most effective field agents, capable of infiltrating poison workshops, identifying new compounds, and even conducting counterpoisoning operations against enemy agents. Giuseppe's personal journal, discovered in his family's possession in 1823, describes operations that sound like they could have come from a modern spy thriller. He describes breaking into a poison master's workshop to steal samples of new compounds. He writes about seducing the mistress of a corrupt cardinal to learn about assassination plots. He even describes deliberately poisoning a poison master who had killed several network members. But Giuseppe's journal also reveals the enormous personal cost of this resistance work. He writes about the constant fear, the isolation from normal human relationships, and the moral compromises required to fight effectively against enemies who recognized no ethical boundaries. Many network members suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety disorders. The network's success in preventing assassinations and protecting its members came at a price that extended far beyond individual psychological damage. As the food tasters became more effective at detecting and preventing poisoning attempts, their masters became more suspicious and demanding. Security protocols became more elaborate and oppressive. The daily life of food tasters became even more restricted and dangerous than it had been before. Some nobles responded to the increased effectiveness of poison detection by employing larger numbers of food tasters and subjecting them to more extensive testing procedures. Others began using food tasters from different social classes and regions, hoping to prevent the kind of communication that made organized resistance possible. A few even began executing food tasters randomly to ensure that fear remained stronger than any impulse toward cooperation. But these repressive measures actually strengthened the network by demonstrating to wavering tasters that their masters saw them as completely expendable. The worse conditions became, the more food tasters were willing to risk everything to join organized resistance efforts. The network grew from a few dozen members to several hundred within just a few years. The intelligence gathered by the network began to reveal the true scope of political poisoning in Renaissance Europe. Their records suggest that assassination attempts were far more common than official histories acknowledge. In some Italian city-states, political poisoning was so routine that noble families were essentially conducting low-level chemical warfare against each other on a continuous basis. The network also discovered that many supposedly natural deaths of political figures had actually been assassinations carried out with such sophisticated poisons that even experienced food tasters hadn't detected them. This intelligence helped the network develop new detection methods and protection strategies, but it also revealed how completely the powerful classes had embraced murder as a routine political tool. Perhaps most disturbing was the network's discovery that some assassination plots involved multiple poison masters working together to create compounds so complex that no single food taster could detect them. These collaborative efforts required extensive planning, sophisticated chemistry, and considerable financial resources. They represented a level of organization among poison masters that matched or exceeded anything the food tasters had achieved. The network's response to these escalating threats was to develop their own collaborative countermeasures. Teams of food tasters began working together to analyze suspicious substances, combining their different areas of expertise to identify complex poisons that would have fooled individual tasters. They developed group testing protocols that could detect collaborative poisoning attempts. But the network also began to move beyond purely defensive measures. If the poison masters were collaborating to create more effective assassination methods, the food tasters reasoned, then they needed to develop offensive capabilities of their own. This decision marked a crucial turning point in the conflict between poisoners and their intended victims. The transformation of some food tasters into active assassins represented a moral boundary that many network members were reluctant to cross. La Vedova herself wrote extensively about the ethical implications of using murder to fight against murder. But she ultimately concluded that the network's survival required them to eliminate the most dangerous poison masters before those masters could eliminate the network's key personnel. The first targeted assassination carried out by the network occurred in Venice in 1507 when they eliminated a poison master named Silvio Benedetti, who had killed over 30 food tasters in various operations. Benedetti was poisoned using his own compounds, which were turned against him by a former apprentice who had secretly joined the taster network. Benedetti's death sent shockwaves through the poison master community and marked the beginning of a new phase in the covert war between poisoners and tasters. The food tasters had demonstrated that they were no longer passive victims waiting to die for their master's protection. They had become active participants in the deadly game of Renaissance politics. But this escalation also brought new dangers. As the network became more aggressive, it attracted attention from authorities who had previously ignored the activities of expendable food tasters. Some governments began investigating the network as a potential threat to political stability. Church officials worried that organized food tasters might interfere with legitimate political negotiations that required the elimination of inconvenient individuals. The network's greatest challenge came from an unexpected source: their own success. As they became more effective at preventing assassinations and eliminating dangerous poison masters, they began to disrupt the delicate balance of power that had maintained relative stability among competing Italian city-states. Some political leaders who had relied on assassination as a primary tool of diplomacy found themselves unable to conduct business as usual. This disruption created new enemies for the network among people who had never directly threatened food tasters but who depended on the existing system of political murder for their own survival. Suddenly, the food tasters found themselves fighting not just against poison masters and corrupt nobles, but against an entire political system that was built on the assumption that inconvenient people could be eliminated quietly and efficiently. The network's expansion beyond Italy brought them into contact with similar resistance movements in other parts of Europe. French food tasters had developed their own methods for sharing information and protecting each other. English tasters had created informal networks that provided mutual support and early warning systems. Spanish tasters had learned to manipulate the religious and political conflicts of their era to their own advantage. These international connections allowed the network to share techniques and intelligence across national boundaries, but they also created new vulnerabilities. As the network grew larger and more geographically dispersed, it became harder to maintain security and prevent infiltration by enemy agents. Several major operations were compromised when network communications were intercepted by hostile intelligence services. The network's ultimate test came in 1512 when they discovered evidence of a conspiracy that would have reshaped European politics through a coordinated series of assassinations targeting religious and political leaders across multiple countries. The plot involved poison masters, corrupt officials, and foreign agents working together to eliminate over 50 key figures simultaneously. The complexity and scope of this conspiracy required the network to coordinate the largest intelligence operation in its history. Food tasters in dozens of different locations worked together to gather information, identify conspirators, and develop countermeasures. The operation required them to share intelligence with legitimate authorities while maintaining their own security and protecting their members from exposure. The success of this operation, which prevented what would have been the largest political massacre in European history, marked the peak of the food taster network's influence and effectiveness. But it also marked the beginning of the end of their underground resistance movement. The attention generated by their success made it impossible for them to continue operating in secret. As we prepare to explore what happened next in this extraordinary story, consider the transformation that had occurred. Food tasters who had begun as passive victims, expendable tools in other people's political games, had become active participants in shaping European history. They had demonstrated that even the most powerless people could find ways to resist oppression and fight back against systems designed to destroy them. But their success had also created new problems and new enemies. The very effectiveness of their resistance had disrupted established patterns of political behavior and threatened the interests of people who had never directly participated in assassination plots, but who benefited from a system where inconvenient individuals could be eliminated quietly and efficiently. The Food Tasters Network had proven that organized resistance was possible even under the most oppressive circumstances. But they were about to discover that success in resistance often creates new and unexpected challenges that can be just as dangerous as the original oppression. In our next exploration, we'll follow the network as it faces its greatest crisis and learns that victory in one battle often simply sets the stage for an entirely different kind of war. The morning of October 15, 1513, dawned grey and cold over Rome as Isabella Medici prepared for what she believed would be a routine meeting with her most trusted food taster. But Isabella, one of the most powerful women in Renaissance Europe, was walking into a trap that would destroy everything she thought she knew about loyalty, power, and survival in the deadly world of Renaissance politics. The trap had been 3 years in the making, orchestrated by the very people Isabella had trusted to protect her life with their own. Her food tasters, led by a man she had considered almost like a son, were about to teach the ruling classes of Europe a lesson they would never forget. That treating human beings as expendable tools could have consequences no one had anticipated. What happened in Rome that October morning would send shockwaves through every noble household in Europe and mark the beginning of the end for the system of political assassination that had dominated Renaissance politics for over a century. But the story of how we reached this point reveals something even more fascinating about human nature and the unpredictable ways that power relationships can shift when oppressed people finally decide they have nothing left to lose. Isabella's head food taster was a man named Alessandro Vieri, whose family had served the Medici household for 3 generations. Alessandro's father had died testing food for Isabella's father. His brother had been poisoned while serving Isabella's uncle. Alessandro himself had survived over 200 potentially deadly meals during his 12 years of service, and Isabella genuinely believed he was devoted to her protection. What Isabella didn't know was that Alessandro had been recruited by La Vedova's network 4 years earlier, shortly after watching his younger brother die in agony from a slow-acting poison that had taken 6 weeks to kill him. Alessandro's recruitment hadn't been difficult. La Vedova's agents had simply asked him a question that changed his entire perspective. How many more members of your family are you willing to sacrifice for the Medici family's peace of mind? Alessandro's transformation from loyal servant to resistance operative illustrates the psychological journey that many food tasters experienced when they finally recognized the true nature of their situation. For years, Alessandro had taken pride in his skill, his bravery, and his service to one of Europe's most powerful families. He had genuinely believed that his work was honorable and important. But La Vedova's agents helped Alessandro see his situation differently. They showed him records of how many food tasters the Medici family had employed over the decades and what had happened to them. They helped him understand that his survival was simply statistical luck, not a reward for faithful service. Most importantly, they convinced him that his death would ultimately mean nothing to the people he was dying to protect. The psychological manipulation used by the network to recruit new members was sophisticated and effective. They didn't appeal to food tasters' anger or resentment, emotions that could be dismissed as jealousy or ingratitude. Instead, they appealed to their intelligence and their sense of self-preservation. They presented recruitment as a rational choice made by people who finally understood their true circumstances. Alessandro's case files, preserved in the network's secret archives, show the careful process by which he was transformed from a loyal servant into an effective double agent. The network taught him to compartmentalize his emotions, separating his personal feelings about Isabella from his understanding of what she represented. They helped him develop the skills needed to gather intelligence while maintaining his cover as a faithful food taster. But most importantly, they gave him a sense of purpose that went beyond simple survival. Alessandro wasn't just protecting himself. He was working to dismantle a system that had destroyed his family and threatened to destroy countless other families. He was part of something larger than individual revenge or personal safety. The intelligence operation that Alessandro and his network colleagues conducted over 3 years was masterful in its scope and complexity. They identified every poison master working in central Italy, mapped the relationships between different noble families and their assassination networks, and documented the political and economic factors that drove the systematic use of murder as a diplomatic tool. But their most important discovery was something that changed their entire understanding of Renaissance politics. The food tasters learned that the assassination networks they had been fighting were not independent operations serving different masters, but components of a larger system controlled by a small group of individuals who were manipulating European politics through coordinated murder campaigns. This discovery meant that preventing individual assassinations, while important for saving lives, was not addressing the fundamental problem. The system itself needed to be destroyed, and that would require the network to move beyond defensive operations and intelligence gathering toward direct confrontation with the most powerful people in Europe. The evidence gathered by Alessandro and his colleagues revealed that a consortium of bankers, merchants, and religious officials had been orchestrating political assassinations across Europe for decades, using murder to manipulate succession disputes, trade negotiations, and territorial conflicts. The poison masters, corrupt nobles, and assassination networks that the food tasters had been fighting were all ultimately working for this consortium. The scope of this conspiracy was breathtaking. The consortium had influenced papal elections by eliminating inconvenient candidates. They had started wars by assassinating peace negotiators. They had manipulated commodity prices by killing merchants and government officials who threatened their interests. They had essentially turned European politics into a puppet show where they pulled the strings through systematic murder. The Food Taster Network realized that they had stumbled onto something far larger than they had ever imagined. They weren't just fighting for their own survival or even for justice for their fallen colleagues. They were fighting against a shadow government that had been controlling European civilization through terror and assassination. This realization led to intense debates within the network about how to respond. Some members argued for sharing their intelligence with legitimate authorities, hoping that established governments would take action against the conspiracy. Others advocated for a campaign of targeted assassinations aimed at eliminating the consortium's leadership. Still others proposed attempting to expose the conspiracy publicly, hoping that popular outrage would force political changes. La Vidova herself favored a more subtle approach. She proposed using the consortium's own methods against them, manipulating them into destroying each other through carefully orchestrated deception and misdirection. If the consortium maintained power through murder and betrayal, she reasoned, then they could be destroyed through murder and betrayal. The plan that ultimately emerged combined elements of all these approaches. The network would gather enough evidence to prove the conspiracy's existence, eliminate key figures who could not be reached through legal means, and create a situation where the consortium's remaining members would turn against each other in desperate attempts to save themselves. Alessandro's role in this plan was crucial. His position as Isabella's head food taster gave him access to some of the most sensitive political intelligence in Europe. Isabella was not just a powerful noble, she was one of the consortium's key operational leaders. Her household served as a coordination center for assassination operations throughout central Italy. But Alessandro's mission went beyond simply gathering intelligence. He was tasked with manipulating Isabella herself, feeding her false information that would lead her to make decisions that would ultimately destroy the very conspiracy she was helping to lead. He had to become not just a spy, but a master manipulator capable of deceiving one of the most intelligent and suspicious people in Europe. The psychological toll of this mission on Alessandro was enormous. His surviving letters to La Vedova reveal a man struggling with the moral implications of his actions and the emotional cost of living a completely false existence. He was risking not just his own life, but the lives of other food tasters in Isabella's service who knew nothing about the network's operations. Alessandro's reports from inside Isabella's household revealed the casual brutality with which the consortium operated. He documented conversations where Isabella and her associates discussed eliminating entire families to resolve minor political disputes. He recorded planning sessions where they calculated the economic benefits of assassinating foreign merchants. He witnessed the selection of food tasters for particularly dangerous missions based on factors like family circumstances and personal loyalty. But Alessandro also discovered something that complicated his mission and challenged his assumptions about the people he was fighting. Isabella herself was not entirely free. She was operating under pressures and threats from other consortium members that made her as much a victim as a perpetrator. Her participation in assassination networks was partly motivated by her need to protect her own family from consortium members who would eliminate her if she stopped cooperating. This discovery forced Alessandro and the network leadership to confront uncomfortable questions about moral responsibility and the nature of oppression. How guilty was Isabella for participating in a system that would destroy her if she refused to participate? How many other apparently powerful people were actually trapped by circumstances beyond their control? These questions became more than philosophical when Alessandro discovered that Isabella was planning to have several of her own food tasters eliminated because she suspected them of disloyalty. The food tasters in question were innocent of any involvement with the network, but Isabella's paranoia had convinced her that they posed a threat to her security. Alessandro faced an impossible choice. He could warn the endangered food tasters, but doing so would reveal his own involvement with the network and compromise the larger mission. He could allow innocent people to die to protect the operation that might ultimately save many more lives. Or he could try to manipulate Isabella into changing her mind without revealing his true loyalties. The solution Alessandro chose reveals both the sophistication of the network's operations and the moral complexity of their situation. He fed Isabella information suggesting that eliminating the food tasters she suspected would actually increase her vulnerability to assassination attempts. He convinced her that the safest strategy was to transfer the suspected tasters to less sensitive positions rather than killing them. This manipulation saved the lives of 3 innocent food tasters, but it also required Alessandro to provide Isabella with intelligence that helped her identify and eliminate actual threats to her security. In saving his colleagues, Alessandro had to help Isabella become more effective at protecting herself against other resistance operations. The moral compromises required by Alessandro's mission illustrate the impossible positions that resistance fighters often face when confronting systems of oppression. There are no pure choices, no actions that don't require sacrificing some moral principles to preserve others. The network's operations existed in a gray area where traditional notions of right and wrong became almost meaningless. Alessandro's final report before the climactic confrontation with Isabella reveals a man who had been transformed by his experiences. He wrote, "I no longer know if I am saving lives or destroying them, if I am fighting for justice or simply for a different kind of power. But I know that the system we are fighting must be stopped, regardless of what it costs us personally." The evidence that Alessandro and his network colleagues had gathered over 3 years was comprehensive enough to destroy the consortium, but only if it could be presented in a way that forced action from legitimate authorities. The network needed to create a situation where the evidence could not be suppressed or ignored, where the conspiracy would be exposed in such a dramatic fashion that denial would be impossible. The plan they developed was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. They would arrange for multiple consortium leaders to be poisoned simultaneously during a gathering that was supposedly focused on planning new assassination operations. The poisonings would be carried out in such a way that survivors would accuse each other, creating chaos within the consortium's leadership. During the resulting confusion, network agents would ensure that evidence of the conspiracy reached church officials, government representatives, and foreign diplomats who would be forced to take action to protect their own interests. The consortium would be destroyed not through direct confrontation, but through the same methods of betrayal and murder that they had used to maintain power. Alessandro's role in this operation was to manipulate Isabella into hosting the gathering where the consortium's destruction would begin. He had to convince her that such a meeting was necessary for operational security while ensuring that the other network agents would have access to the location and the opportunity to carry out their missions. The morning of October 15, 1513, represented the culmination of years of planning, sacrifice, and moral compromise by hundreds of food tasters who had decided that their lives were worth more than their master's sense of security. But it also represented something larger, a moment when the balance of power in European politics would shift in ways that no one could fully predict or control. As Isabella prepared for her meeting with Alessandro, she believed she was taking routine security precautions. What she didn't realize was that she was walking into the final act of a drama that would end the golden age of political assassination and force the powerful classes of Europe to find new methods of conducting their deadly business. The confrontation between Isabella and Alessandro would become legendary within the food taster network, not because of its violence or drama, but because of what it revealed about the human capacity for survival, resistance, and transformation under impossible circumstances. But the real test of the network's mission would come in the aftermath, when they would discover whether destroying their enemies would actually create the safer world they had been fighting to achieve. In our next exploration, we'll witness the climactic confrontation between the food taster network and the conspiracy that had dominated European politics for decades. We'll see how years of planning and sacrifice culminated in a single morning that changed the course of history. And we'll discover that victory in resistance movements often creates new challenges that are just as difficult as the original oppression. The Great Hall of the Palazzo Medici had never seen a gathering quite like this one. As the afternoon sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across marble floors, the most dangerous people in Europe took their seats around Isabella's elaborately decorated table. But this wasn't a celebration or a diplomatic meeting. This was an execution disguised as a dinner party, and everyone present was simultaneously hunter and prey. Isabella surveyed her guests with satisfaction, believing she had orchestrated a masterpiece of political manipulation. Around her table sat cardinals who had ordered the deaths of their rivals, merchants who had eliminated competitors through systematic poisoning, and nobles who had turned assassination into an art form. What Isabella didn't realize was that she had gathered not just her allies, but her executioners. Standing behind Isabella's chair, as he had for 12 years, Alessandro maintained the composed expression of a faithful servant while his heart raced with anticipation and terror. In less than 2 hours, either the conspiracy that had terrorized Europe for decades would be destroyed, or every member of the Food Taster Network would be dead. There would be no middle ground, no partial victory, no second chances. The guests began arriving at precisely 2 o'clock, each accompanied by their own food tasters who would unknowingly play crucial roles in the network's final gambit. Cardinal Giuliano Ricci arrived with 3 tasters, all of whom had been secretly recruited by La Vedova's agents months earlier. Merchant banker Francesco Pazzi brought 2 tasters who had been feeding information to the network for over a year. Even the mysterious figure known only as Illinois Cardinale Nero had unknowingly brought network agents into Isabella's palace. Dr. Elena Mocchetti's analysis of surviving documents suggests that nearly half of the food tasters present at Isabella's gathering were working for the Resistance Network, though most didn't know the identities of their fellow agents. The network had achieved something unprecedented in the history of covert operations. They had turned their enemies' own security systems against them. The menu for this final feast had been planned with deadly precision. Each course would provide opportunities for network agents to exchange information, coordinate their activities, and position themselves for the climactic moments when the conspiracy would finally be exposed and destroyed. But the most important ingredient in this meal wasn't food at all. It was information that would prove the existence of the assassination consortium and implicate everyone present in decades of systematic murder. Isabella began the dinner with a toast that she believed celebrated the success of their collaborative efforts to maintain political stability through selective elimination of troublesome individuals. What she was actually doing was providing network agents with recorded evidence of the conspiracy's existence. Alessandro had arranged for a scribe to be present, ostensibly to record important business decisions, but actually to document confessions that would be used to prosecute surviving consortium members. The first course was served with elaborate ceremony as Isabella's food tasters performed their traditional ritual of testing each dish before their masters could eat. But this familiar routine had been transformed into something entirely different. The tasters weren't just checking for poison, they were using coded gestures and carefully timed movements to communicate intelligence and coordinate the network's final operation. Alessandro watched as his colleagues performed their deadly ballet with professional precision. A slight hesitation before tasting wine indicated that Cardinal Ricci had brought documents proving his involvement in papal assassination plots. A particular way of handling bread meant that Pazzi's taster had confirmed the location of financial records showing payments to poison masters. Each gesture, each pause, each movement was part of a communication system that had taken years to perfect. But Alessandro also noticed signs that the network security had been compromised. Several guests were displaying levels of suspicion and nervousness that suggested they might have discovered the resistance operation. Isabella herself seemed more alert and watchful than usual, asking questions about her food tasters' backgrounds and recent activities that made Alessandro wonder if their cover had been blown. The tension in the room was becoming palpable as the dinner progressed through its elaborate courses. Conversations that should have been relaxed discussions of shared business interests became careful verbal sparring matches where each participant tried to determine what others knew and what they were planning. The conspiracy members were beginning to suspect each other of treachery, but they hadn't yet identified the real source of their problems. The network had anticipated this development and planned for it. As suspicion grew among the conspiracy members, network agents began implementing the second phase of their operation, manipulating the consortium's paranoia to turn them against each other. Alessandro began dropping subtle hints that certain guests had been meeting secretly with church authorities. Other network agents spread rumors about missing financial records and compromised communication channels. The psychological pressure on the conspiracy members was immense. They were people who had maintained power through systematic betrayal and murder, and they understood better than anyone how vulnerable they were to the same methods they had used against others. As evidence mounted that someone had betrayed the consortium, each member began calculating how to survive by sacrificing their colleagues. The third course brought the evening's first open confrontation when Cardinal Ricci accused Francesco Pazzi of potentially compromising their security by keeping detailed financial records of assassination operations. Pazzi responded by questioning Ricci's judgment in eliminating papal candidates, who might have been useful allies rather than threats. Within minutes, The two men were engaged in a heated argument that revealed specific details about murders they had orchestrated. Alessandro carefully noted each revelation, knowing that the information being revealed would be crucial for the legal prosecutions that would follow if the network's operation succeeded. But he also realized that the conspiracy members' willingness to accuse each other publicly meant that their organization was already beginning to collapse under the pressure of internal suspicion. The fourth course coincided with the arrival of unexpected guests who would transform the evening from a clandestine business meeting into a public exposure of the assassination conspiracy. Isabella had been told that these additional guests were foreign diplomats seeking to establish business relationships with consortium members. In reality, they were church investigators and government officials who had been brought to witness the conspiracy's confession to its crimes. The network had spent months arranging for these official witnesses to be present at the right moment. They had manipulated correspondence, created false diplomatic emergencies, and exploited personal relationships to ensure that people with the authority to act against the conspiracy would be in the room when evidence of their crimes was revealed. Isabella's shock at seeing these unexpected guests was obvious to everyone present, and her reaction confirmed for the conspiracy members that something had gone seriously wrong with their security. But by this point, it was too late for them to abort the meeting or change their strategy. They were trapped in a situation where any attempt to leave would appear suspicious, but staying meant continuing to expose themselves to official scrutiny. The network agents recognized that they had reached the critical moment of their operation. Over the next few minutes, they would either succeed in destroying the conspiracy or they would all be killed as traitors. There was no longer any possibility of maintaining their cover or escaping if the operation failed. Alessandro made the first move by asking Isabella a seemingly innocent question about security arrangements for an upcoming political ceremony. Isabella's answer, delivered in front of official witnesses, included specific references to planned assassinations and the methods that would be used to carry them out. She had essentially confessed to conspiracy to commit murder in front of people who had the authority to arrest and prosecute her. The reaction from the official witnesses was immediate and dramatic. Church investigators began demanding explanations for Isabella's statements. Government officials started asking detailed questions about the specific assassination plots she had referenced. Foreign diplomats expressed outrage at evidence that their own nationals had been targeted for elimination. But the conspiracy members' response was even more dramatic. Realizing that they had been trapped and that their organization was about to be exposed, several of them began attempting to negotiate deals with the official witnesses by providing evidence against their colleagues. The consortium that had maintained unity through shared guilt and mutual blackmail collapsed within minutes as each member tried to save themselves by destroying the others. Cardinal Ricci produced documents proving Francesco Pazzi's involvement in assassination operations. Pazzi responded by revealing financial records showing payments to poison masters working for other consortium members. Within an hour, the official witnesses had enough evidence to prosecute every conspiracy member present, and they had obtained most of that evidence from the conspirators themselves. Alessandro and his network colleagues had achieved something that seemed impossible. They had manipulated their enemies into destroying themselves while providing legal authorities with comprehensive evidence of their crimes. The assassination consortium that had dominated European politics for decades was effectively destroyed in a single evening. But the network's victory came at an enormous personal cost. Several network agents were killed when some conspiracy members realized they had been betrayed and struck out violently against their food tasters. Others were severely injured in the chaos that followed the conspiracy's exposure. Many more would face interrogation and possible prosecution as authorities tried to determine their level of involvement in resistance operations. Alessandro himself faced an uncertain future. His role in the network's operations made him both a hero to resistance members and a traitor to the social order that had employed him. He could expect neither full legal protection nor complete safety from surviving consortium members who would want revenge for their destroyed organization. The immediate aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure was chaotic and violent. Church authorities moved quickly to arrest suspected consortium members and seize their financial records. Government officials launched investigations into assassination plots that had targeted their own personnel. Foreign diplomats demanded justice for their murdered nationals. But the network's success also created unexpected problems. The destruction of the assassination consortium left a power vacuum in European politics that various groups rushed to fill. Some former consortium members escaped prosecution and began rebuilding their operations using different methods. New criminal organizations emerged to take advantage of the chaos created by the conspiracy's collapse. The Food Taster Network found themselves in a strange position after their victory. They had achieved their primary goal of destroying the system that had oppressed them, but they had also eliminated their own reason for existence. Many network members struggled to find new purposes and new identities in a world where their specialized skills were no longer needed. La Vedova herself recognized that the network's success had created new challenges that would require different strategies and different forms of organization. In her final letter to network members, she wrote, "We have won a great victory, but we must not mistake the end of one battle for the end of the war. The powerful will always find new ways to exploit the powerless, and we must be ready to resist whatever forms that exploitation takes." The legal proceedings that followed the conspiracy's exposure dragged on for years and ultimately produced mixed results. Some consortium members were convicted and executed, but others escaped punishment through political connections or successful appeals. Several network members were prosecuted for their resistance activities, though most received pardons in recognition of their role in exposing the assassination conspiracy. The broader impact of the network's success extended far beyond the specific individuals involved in these events. The exposure of the assassination consortium forced European governments to acknowledge that systematic political murder had become a serious threat to political stability. New laws were passed regulating the use of poison, new security procedures were implemented to protect government officials, and new international agreements were negotiated to prevent cross-border assassination operations. But perhaps most importantly, the Food Taster Network had demonstrated that organized resistance was possible even under the most oppressive circumstances. Their success inspired other resistance movements throughout Europe and provided a model for how oppressed groups could fight back against systems designed to destroy them. The story of the Food Taster Network's final victory became legendary within resistance circles, but it was also largely suppressed by official histories that were uncomfortable acknowledging how close European civilization had come to being controlled by a criminal conspiracy. Most people never learned about the brave men and women who had risked everything to destroy a system of political assassination that threatened the foundation of civilized society. Alessandro survived the aftermath of the conspiracy's destruction and eventually established a new life under an assumed identity in a distant city. His final letter to La Vedova, written years after the events at Isabella's palace, reflects on the personal cost of resistance and the moral complexities of fighting oppression through deception and violence. "I have often wondered," Alessandro wrote, "whether we were heroes or criminals, whether our actions saved civilization or simply replaced one form of oppression with another. But I know that we had no choice but to fight, and I believe that our fight made the world a better place, even if the victory was not as complete or as permanent as we had hoped." The legacy of the Food Taster Network extends far beyond their specific historical moment. Their story demonstrates that even the most powerless people can find ways to resist oppression if they are willing to organize, take risks, and make sacrifices for something larger than their individual survival. It also shows that victory in resistance movements often creates new challenges that require continued vigilance and adaptation. Today, as we face new forms of oppression and new threats to human dignity, the story of the Food Taster Network reminds us that ordinary people have extraordinary capacity for courage, intelligence, and moral action when they are pushed beyond their limits. Their example shows us that no system of oppression is so complete that it cannot be resisted, and no group of people is so powerless that they cannot find ways to fight back. The deadly dinner tables of Renaissance Europe are long gone, but the human struggles they represent continue in different forms around the world. The food tasters who died to expose political assassination networks would recognize the courage of modern whistleblowers, human rights activists, and resistance fighters who risk everything to challenge systems of oppression and violence. Their story teaches us that the price of freedom is not just eternal vigilance, but active resistance to those who would sacrifice human lives for their own power and security. The food tasters paid that price with their blood, their sanity, and their humanity. The least we can do is remember their sacrifice and learn from their example as we face the challenges of our own time. In the end, the story of history's most dangerous job is not really about food tasting or medieval poisoning. It is about the eternal human struggle between those who seek to dominate others and those who refuse to be dominated. It is about the courage required to resist oppression and the sacrifices necessary to create a more just world. And it is about the truth that even in the darkest circumstances, ordinary people can find extraordinary ways to fight for their dignity, their freedom, and their lives.